Hello, I'm Chaplain John Rollison with the Dobbins Air Reserve Base Chapel, and thank you so much for joining us this morning for our study of the Ascension of Jesus into heaven. Of course, the Ascension is a pivotal part of Christianity. A few days ago, we celebrated Easter and Resurrection Sunday, and what a blessing that was. And of course, it's a pivotal understanding of the Christian faith that after Jesus was resurrected, he was on earth for 40 days, and then he ascended into heaven in front of over 500 witnesses. Today we're just going to take a brief look at this, just take a few minutes, just a summary. There are many Old Testament references that I'm not going to get into. I'm just going to look at a few from the gospel, then a philosophical problem, as well as the historical credibility of what we read in the gospels. Now, there are many anticipatory references to the Lord's ascension during his earthly ministry. One is found in the Gospel of Luke, chapter 9, verse 51, where we read, "The days drew near for him to be received up." Of course, this is a reference to the ascension. There are many others in the Gospels, again, that I'm not going to have time to reference because I want to make this a brief study. But there are several in the Gospel of John as well. And John makes repeated references to a coming time when Jesus will be glorified, which is an inclusive word signifying the whole process of death, burial, resurrection, but also the ascension. He references that in chapter 7, chapter 12, chapter 13, and chapter 17, just to name a few places. Also, Jesus himself spoke repeatedly of going to his Father, and particularly he references the ascension in the Gospel of John chapter 6, verse 62, where we read, "What if you were to see the Son of Man ascending into heaven where he was before?" A very good reference to the ascension before it happened, an anticipatory reference, we might say. Now, the philosophical problem that we could read about would be the localization of the spiritual world. Now, for this, I'm indebted to the late Dr. Merrill C. Tenney, but he wrote this about the philosophical problem. "The account seems to suggest that heaven is located a short distance above the earth. However, modern science makes this picture untenable. But surely this criticism takes the narrative in too literal a sense. The language is symbolic. We should picture Christ as transferring not from one position to another, but from one condition to another." As C.S. Lewis comments, now Merrill Tenney is referencing C.S. Lewis in his book Miracles, of course the ascension being a great miracle, so of course C.S. Lewis is going to talk about it in his book. C.S. Lewis wrote this, "Perhaps a mere instantaneous vanishing would make us feel more comfortable. But if the spectators say they saw first a short vertical movement and then a vague luminosity," which is what the cloud presumably means here, as it certainly does in the account of the Transfiguration, "and then nothing, have we any reason to object?" Now, that's a rhetorical question, which I'll answer for C.S. Lewis. No. If so many people say they saw that, then we have no reason to object. Now, one thing that I'm going to point out, and I'm going to point this out again at the end of the study, was Luke's reason for writing this. And Luke was praised for being an excellent historian, which is something we're going to talk about in a moment as well. But Luke wrote this in the book of Luke, the Gospel of Luke, chapter 1, verse 1, "Many have undertaken to compile a narrative about the events that have been fulfilled among us, just as the original eyewitnesses and servants of the word handed it down to us. And it seemed good to me, since I have carefully investigated everything from the very first, to write to you in orderly sequence." So his whole purpose was to investigate and write this out accurately. He wrote it for his friend Theophilus, but we can learn so much from it as well. And we're grateful for the time that he took to write this down. So in other words, there is historical credibility to what Luke wrote. Now I'm going to quote Dr. Tenney again, who wrote this, "Luke's writing throughout is that of the careful historian who verified facts from original written sources and from direct interrogation of witnesses," which is what he said there in verses 1 and 2, which we just read together. Now, for an event which stands as the critical junction between the Gospel of Luke and the book of Acts, it's essential for the continuity of Jesus' deeds and teachings in his ascended state. It would be incredible that Luke should not verify the details of their experience firsthand from the surviving apostles. And our knowledge of the bodily appearances of the risen Christ to his disciples through the weeks subsequent to the resurrection is based on solid historical evidence and it's equally dependable that these bodily appearances come to an end when our Lord at his ascension reassumed his position of supreme authority at God's right hand. So that's what Dr. Tenney wrote about the historical accuracy of Luke's writings. Now I'm going to quote Mike Licona, who's at Houston Baptist University, an excellent apologist, and he wrote this when he was talking about the historical reliability and the credibility of the Gospel of Luke. He references three leaders of the early church named Clement of Rome, Polycarp, and Ignatius, and how they all mention Jesus' resurrection and ascension. Now, two of them, Clement and Polycarp, they knew the apostles Peter and John. And Clement of Rome and Polycarp are probably repeating some of the information that they heard from Peter and from John. And though Ignatius is fairly early and was a friend of Polycarp, there's no reason to think that he knew one of the Gospels, although it's possible he did. Historians must primarily concern themselves with matters that are probable, not possible. And since it's probable that Clement and Polycarp heard about Jesus' resurrection from Peter and John, they are primary sources related to that event. And although they mention Jesus' resurrection and ascension on a few occasions, they do not provide any details. Now, the details of it are recorded for us by Luke in the book of Acts, chapter 1, verse 9, which we're going to read in a moment. But again, I want to share another reference to the credibility and the accuracy of Luke's account. And now I'm going to quote a man named Mike Nelson, who wrote a wonderful article about the Ascension. And he wrote that indeed Luke's Gospel and his Acts of the Apostles, which are, of course, companion volumes, have been touted by scholars of ancient history and archaeology as impressively accurate. The great archaeologist Sir William Ramsay famously acknowledged Luke as a historian of first rank. A more recent study of Luke's historical accuracy, such as that by classical scholar Colin Hemer, have further confirmed the deservedness of this high praise. Therefore, when Luke describes Jesus' bodily ascension into the heavens, we have good reason to believe that Luke was reporting real history. To quote Luke 1 again, chapter 1, verse 1, a narrative of things which have been accomplished, just as they were delivered to us by those who were eyewitnesses from the beginning. And here's his account of the ascension into heaven. Acts chapter 1, verse 9. After he said this, he was taken up as they were watching, and a cloud received him out of their sight. And again, as Merrill C. Tenney said, we should think of it not as transferring from one position to another, but from one condition to another. And again, to quote C.S. Lewis, have we any reason to object? And I would say no. I pray that this was thought-provoking. I pray this was an encouragement for you. I originally did this study for my son, John. I love you, son, and I hope this helps.